If, yep, perfect. I was about to say if you want to start the recording. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Area Archivists Hiring Panel. I'm Mary Pedraza. I am a member of the Programming Committee of CAA, and I'm also an associate in records management at Invenergy LLC, which is a Chicago-based clean energy company. But I am an archivist at heart. So I'm really excited to welcome our panelists today and everyone who's attending. We will have our three panelists here, and I will introduce them if I get to that part of my work doc. There we go. Our panelists are Dana Lamparello, who is our head of public services at McCormick Library of Special Collections and University Archives at Northwestern University. Go Cats. Uh, Hillary Pittman Pozeski is founder and lead archivist of Sepia Archival Management, and Katie Grobmeyer, lead account executive at Beacon Hill Staffing Group. So our panelists here are going to uh, introduce themselves, and then we'll go through a couple guided questions, and then we have some questions about hiring from the registration, and we can get into a Q&A. Our main event is scheduled to go till about 3:45, and then we will stop recording at that point because this will go up on the CAA YouTube for people who can't make it today. And then after 3:45, it'll be an open Q&A. But before we get into the questions, I will let our panelists introduce themselves and talk about, what kind of host hiring they do. So we'll just go in the order I just did. So go ahead, Dana.
Thank you, Mary. My name is Dana Lamparello. As Mary mentioned, I'm head of public services for the McCormick Library of Special Collections and University Archives at Northwestern University. Um, I am an archivist by training, but I've held a variety of positions. I've been a more traditional archivist, a digital archivist, metadata and digitization librarian, and now I'm in public services. And I've been at a mix of mainly cultural and academic archives. I think at this point, I've been probably longer in academic archives. And the hiring that I've done a lot over the years. In fact, I see at least one of the folks I have hired in the past in the audience today. Um, so I've had to hire full-time archivists. I've had to hire, project staff, project archivists, digital technicians, photographers, vendors, and paraprofessional positions in archives, as well as students in archives.
All right. Go for it, Hillary.
All right. Hi there. I am Hillary Pittman Pozeski. Um, and as Mary mentioned, uh, what am I? I'm a founder of CB Archival Management. My path to archives is actually a mid-career shift, which think really shapes how I approach the work. Going way back, I majored in communications with a minor in marketing. And then I went straight to grad school and got an MA in journalism. And while I did have some writing gigs in my 20s, I eventually moved into online marketing. And then I spent about 15 years as a consultant for doing basically primarily on strategy and implementation for advertising campaigns for online retailers. So I'm telling you this, because I built my own marketing consultancy. I had multiple people working with me at my organization. So again, I did that for about 15 years. And so that gave me a really strong foundation in consulting. But I also found that thinking about structure and translating complex ideas into, like digestible information that I provided to clients ended up being skills that, translated more directly into archival work than I expected. So after that, I've got a little bit of a varied story before I get to archives. So then I moved into freelance writing, mainly essays about history for magazines and newspapers. I'm also working on a book based on family history that one day I'll finish. But the point is, during that gig, I did a considerable amount of research in archival collections for the writing that I was doing, and that was really my entry point into the field. I really got a good firsthand look at how collections function, what makes them accessible, what makes them difficult to navigate, and how much the underlying organization of an archive really matters. So it's kind of what led me to go back and get a professional certificate in archives and cultural heritage. And then in 2021, I co-founded CPA Archival Management. So CP is an archival consultancy. The work spans a pretty wide range. Some of my better known clients have included Chicago Public Art Group, the Union League Club, American Society for Surgery of the Hand. And I also work with individuals on private projects. So on the one end, I'm doing strategic advising, helping organizations to figure out what they have and how to manage it. On the other hand, I'm doing really hands-on work, processing collections, organizing, finding aids, all that good stuff. Um, so at this point, I work with a range of clients. I usually have multiple projects going on at once. Each one is a little bit different levels of organization, different goals. So the work is very varied, and that's what I like about it. But from the hiring perspective, I'm coming at this from two angles. So on one hand, as a consultant, I'm someone who is regularly bidding for jobs and hopefully being hired. So I'm kind of in your shoes in that I'm putting together proposals and defining scopes of work, thinking a lot about how to communicate what I do and how I approach it. So I understand, what being on the candidate side of the process is like. And I should also mention that in the Q&A section, I'm happy to answer any general questions about archival consulting, being an archival consultant. But on the other hand of what I'm doing is I'm hiring archivists to work with me on some of the projects that I take on. These are typically short-term positions or oftentimes paid internships. Most often they're focused on processing collections or doing digitization work. Um, what the hiring that I'm doing is really tied to specific projects. It's bringing people into active work where there's already a defined scope, a set of materials, and a timeline in place. And I think that context really shapes my perspective and that it's really grounded in the realities of project-based archival work, where you're moving between collections, you're working with, real constraints, heavy-duty constraints of time and scope. So that's the lens I'm bringing to the conversation, both as someone who is hired as a consultant and someone who is hiring others into that same kind of environment.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. And Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Grovemeyer, and I'm with a company called Beacon Hill Staffing Group. And I've been with Beacon Hill for, it'll be 10 years actually next month, but I've been in the staffing world for close to 20 years. So I've spent my career partnering with companies all across Chicago in just about every industry, including education, financial services, you name it. I've placed individuals with them, but I focus on placing contract and contract to hire, as well as direct hire candidates for companies. And so that's actually how I met Mary. She has some contractors on her team that I and my team placed with her. So oftentimes we'll place candidates that have that are archivists into record management positions, document management, or even some employers are looking for candidates with transferable skills where that would translate into something that they need help with, maybe on a project basis, or maybe they have a new position that they're creating. But we work with a lot of candidates who are even looking to us for temporary work just to, gain supplemental income while they're looking for something more in line with their long-term kind of career path. So there's many different ways that we can, help candidates such as yourselves find employment. And one of the things I wanted to mention too, kind of a shameless plug here, is that oftentimes staffing firms such as Beacon Hill will have access to positions that aren't posted, and so oftentimes employers will come to us and they don't even post it themselves. They're like, we're not going to handle the hiring or the recruitment for this. You guys handle it. So we do have access to jobs that not everybody can apply to directly for the company. And also another good reason to work with a staffing firm is because we can get you in front of the hiring manager pretty quickly. We can just send your resume directly to that person, get you feedback on, if they want to move forward, or maybe if they don't, why, just to help you with your job search. And we can also provide you detailed information about the company, the person that you're meeting with, all of that stuff that you may not, have access to if you were just doing the search on your own. So my team and I have a team of about 5 recruiters. And so we're getting new jobs in every single week. So usually when our clients need a job filled, we fill it, pretty quickly for them. So right now we have a number of candidates with backgrounds similar to yours out working for us. So that's been my experience.
Great. This is very exciting hearing your introductions. So we're going to go into our guiding questions. And again, for those who just joined us, we're having 2 guided questions before we get into an open Q&A. So our first question for the panelists are, what are the most important parts of the hiring process for you? And I'm going to put this in the chat. So let's switch up our order and let's start with Hillary.
Okie dokie. All right, so what are the most important parts of the hiring process for me? Well, I in general tend to focus less on credentials and more on how someone actually, works in the practice. And there are 3 things that I consistently look for. First is evaluating practical skills. I'm interested in what someone has actually done and how they approach real collections, not just whether they can speak the language of archives. Um, and I'll say here that I'm often hiring people for projects that don't have a lot of hands-on experience. I know there are people who had questions about, if you haven't had a lot of experience, how do you work on interviewing? So I talk to a lot of people like that. And that's absolutely okay. I'll often ask candidates to walk me through how they would approach a disorganized or complex collection. If it's someone who has experience, I, kind of ask them some questions about work that they've done. If they don't have experience, then I'll ask them about, experiences I've run across in the past. I ask them things like, what decisions will they make first? How do they think about arrangement, description, and prioritization? That tells me far more, like how you make decisions about, what I find on your resume or just looking at your degree alone. Second to me is adaptability and judgment. Most archival work, I know if everybody's cameras were on, I would get a lot of nodding heads, that most archival work does not happen in ideal conditions. Collections are incomplete, resources are limited. Oftentimes there's not a clear roadmap. So I'm looking for people who can make thoughtful, appropriate decisions with without perfect information. So, can a candidate scale their approach to a situation? Can you avoid over processing while still creating meaningful access? In my experience, good judgment is one of the most important and the hardest to teach skills. And then the third thing for me is communication ability. Archivists are constantly working with people who aren't archivists, whether it's organizational staffs, donors, or the public. So, having an ability to clearly explain what you're doing and why it matters is critical. That shows up in writing, in conversation, and also in how someone listens and interprets needs. The strongest candidates are the ones who can not only do the work, but also translate it in a way that, it builds understanding and trust with the people that you're working with. So I'm really into how someone thinks, how they make decisions in real world conditions, and how effectively they can communicate that work to others. Those 3 things for me are what makes someone successful in the role. And ultimately, I'm looking for people who can bring clarity to complexity and help other people see the value in that work.
Answer. I will just keep going with the switch up. So go ahead, Katie, on this question.
All right. Thank you, Mary. So to me, when I'm looking at the most important part of the hiring process, it's the interview, but it's also really what takes place prior to the interview for a candidate. Oftentimes when we are interviewing candidates or our clients are interviewing, uh, time and time again, candidates show up unprepared, and it comes out during the interview. So this is just going to be kind of some from a general sense of what should be done. So really, before an interview, you should thoroughly research the company that you are going to be interviewing with. And a thing that I always suggest that candidates do that I think a lot of them don't is every company has a section, either like in the news or press releases that they have sent out that I think is really good information that to look up about the company, because this is information that the company has released to the public that is, exciting news, new announcements that they want to share. And so it's a really good kind of snapshot as to what's going on in the company and how that may directly affect, the position that you are applying for. And also research the person that you're going to be interviewing with. So at least you have an idea of what their background is. Always go to LinkedIn. Most people these days have a LinkedIn profile, and see where they've what they've done in their career, what their career progression has been. Sometimes people will post personal things on LinkedIn, so you get a snapshot of kind of maybe what they're interested in that you can bring up during the interview, to build some rapport. And oftentimes interviews are taking place virtually, so this may sound like common sense, but we've come to realize it's not. When you're interviewing virtually, make sure you have a professional background. Make sure you're in a quiet place. Make sure that you have no distractions and your phone is turned off. If it's in person, show up professionally dressed. Make sure you give a good handshake to the person that you're interviewing with. And you always want to maintain good eye contact. Show your enthusiasm for the job. Be friendly, smile. I know this all sounds kind of basic, but it's just things that we see people miss time and time again. And I'm sure nerves has a lot to do with that too. But of course, practice makes perfect. So the more you interview, the better you'll get at this. And then also before each interview, I would write down, 2, 3, even 4 things about yourself that you're proud of, to sell yourself on. Because I know you can get in the interview and, nerves can take over and you might miss, something that you wanted to say. So always have that written down. Don't be afraid to have, some notes in front of you when you're interviewing. Employers don't mind that. But, so many candidates don't know how to, sell themselves. And so think of a time when, say your former boss or, teacher or coworker, whoever the case was, told you you did a good job. Well, what was that about? What was the reason for that? And what did you do that warranted getting that positive feedback? So bring that example. Maybe there was a time where you improved a process or something. Be prepared to talk about that and how did that affect the team and others, and what was the end result? So be as detailed as possible. Or even a time when you thought outside the box and did something that was a bit creative that you got recognition for. So come in with specific and concrete examples on how you have gone above and beyond, so you can articulate that during the interview. Now, from an employer's perspective, I know that there's some individuals on the call who are looking to hire. For employers, what I think is most important during the interview process is transparency. I think sometimes, employers can be so focused on here's why we're so great to work with, and telling all the positive things. It's very important too to talk about what are the challenges in this role. Like what is a true day-to-day what's the day-to-day look like for each person, because you don't want any surprises when somebody gets into a job and then they're thinking, wow, this doesn't sound anything like what it sounded like during, or this isn't any, wasn't like what the interview was. And so then it, may or may not work out. So just be upfront and have real and honest conversations about what the expectations are, and you'll make a better hire if you're transparent and upfront from the very beginning.
I admit I did look up my current boss on LinkedIn when I applied to this job, so highly recommend it. I got to be like, oh, you've worked here for 10 years? That's crazy.
Yeah.
Uh,
And then they
all
know
right.
you did your research.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly.
they'll appreciate that.
All right, Dana, your turn.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, we know how to research, so let's do it, right? Um, so I have a lot to say about this, but I just want to build off of what my other panelists have said. So to Hillary's point about credentials, I do believe a library degree is important, and part of that is because, and this is like when I think about hiring for archivist roles. So even though I'm in public services, I am looking for folks who understand the full life cycle of collections, right? And who understand the bigger picture of even conceptually what we do and why we do it. And so a lot of my interview questions will be an investigation of that. So that's a really important thing that I'm looking for candidates to demonstrate. As well as Hillary mentioned, problem solving and things like that. But I do believe the one-on-one interview is very important, especially when I'm meeting, like if I'm going to be the supervisor of this person, that one-on-one interview is really important. And what I'm looking for is I want to learn the values that you bring to your work. So again, whether you've thought conceptually about this work and not just the tasks, right? I want to know that you can come out of the weeds and you can actually see the forest. Because for me, we need to, also to Hillary's point, right, that we often have to do these things in environments where things aren't perfect, they're underfunded, under-resourced, right? So I need to know that there is, that you understand the greater good of what we're doing too. But yes, also, knowing how you solve problems, and how you behave when you don't know an answer, right? So I think a lot of times us archivists think, well, we know everything, right? Or like we know how to have access to learn everything. But no one is expecting you to know everything. And a lot of things are learned on the job, and that's totally fine. So it's really a matter of, how you behave when you don't know the answer. Do you approach things with curiosity? That's what I'm looking for. How you listen is also very important. And I get that from the one-on-one interview. And I'll tell a quick anecdote here. I was interviewing for an archivist position, interviewing folks for an archivist position. And uh, I think the candidate was so excited to be in this interview that they were finishing my sentences before I could. Like they were trying to finish my sentences, which is fine. And I do it too. It's like a sign of being excited. But what they were saying was the opposite of what I was about to say. And so it was more than just like them being off. What it signaled to me was that they were not listening, and that could actually be an indication that they might be difficult to manage. And so you want to make sure that you're spending the time listening to what the person, that you're interviewing with, what they're saying. And I know it's difficult because there's nerves and you want to just say the things that are important about yourself, but take a beat, listen, and if you need a minute to answer questions, that's fine too. And then ultimately in the interview, I'm looking for, and all that said, as well as your listening skills, I want to see that you have potential to grow and be promoted. And usually that's a gauge of your eagerness. And again, like understanding your uh, passion for the work. and your, ultimately your interest in growing rather than coasting in a position or just being in the weeds only, right? Um, so the other thing that is really important to me when I'm reviewing applications is the cover letter, which, might be like sad trombone to hear. It's just like, oh, great. But for me, the cover letter, especially for archivist roles, it presents an opportunity to demonstrate one of the key skills we all have, which is distilling information to what is most important to know, right? So that cover letter for me is the conduit to more information about you. And so what my process is I will look at the resumes first. I know the job description, and then I'll look at resumes first, and I kind of, in my own head, think, all right, let me make what I'm guessing is, this cover letter should address this, this, and this because it's relevant to our job. And then I'll read the cover letter. And if there's a real, disconnect there, that's, usually an indication that, this candidate doesn't get it, or they're just kind of sending out a kind of standard. They're not tailoring each cover letter and resume to the job description. And so cover letter wise, again, be specific with the projects that you talk about and really focus, and just to echo what my panelists have said, to focus on the impact and your takeaways, right? Not the we're all archivists, we get it. Like we know what a lot of these projects entail, but what was most important to you? What impact did you have? What was your aha moment? Because again, we want to see this process of how you think through things, how you conceptualize your role and the work you're doing, how you problem solve, et cetera. And, don't repeat what's on your resume, but go into different kinds of detail about it. And this is all really standard stuff, but use the language and phrases from the job description, tailor each cover letter and resume for each job description. I see that mistake most commonly. I think people just plug and play with their cover letters. But I think it is worth taking the time. And then to Hillary's point again about credentials, I am the same way, right? Like, I don't think you need to, if the job includes work with a particular system or software, I don't believe you have to have exactly that experience. But if you've been trained, in sort of information science, whatever, I can trust that you have the skills to learn any kind of anything, and and there was a question from a pre-question submitted about the certified archivist certification. And I think this is where I tend to be more a fan. I don't think you need both, but I tend to be more of a fan of the library degree because I do think you get more of a theoretical, you get the mix of like practice-based and the theory. And I do think if you have the right theory, I think you'll be able to figure out the transferable skills. And again, you can boil everything down to, figuring out, like, you don't have to know exactly this standard or exactly this system, but a standard and a system, and that's just fine. Let's see. I also, I know this is difficult when, perhaps you are really desperate to get a job. But I do, especially when it comes to reading cover letters and resumes, you should be picky about what you apply for. If you seem unqualified, and you can't make a case for why you'd be the right fit, that comes through in your cover letter. And so I would argue, don't apply. And so I would urge you all to think quality over quantity. So I see this mistake a lot, and I think it's worth saving your time and energy for the better fit. So you can make a stronger case for yourself versus, just like throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. I think you'll wind up with a more, I think you'll find your career veering in a better direction in that way. And then just to add to, for those hiring, and this sort of builds off of the pickiness of what, you might be applying for. And that isn't to say, like, I don't mean, well, I want to work in a museum, so I'm only going to apply for museum jobs. Look for those skills. What skills do you like to put into practice, and what do you think you would be most qualified for, and then apply for those jobs. But for those doing the hiring, please write a reasonable job description. No one should have to apply for a job description that sounds like 2 or 3 jobs in one. That is insulting to us, right? As applicants. And it's demoralizing. And if you have any ability to curb that or to educate your administration, please take that opportunity to do it, because you're ultimately protecting not just the applicants, but you're also protecting yourself as an archivist. And for those of you applying to these jobs that have every little possible thing and seems like multiple jobs in one, do be wary of them and trust your gut. And I understand, you may not be able to avoid those, but, to the point of, an employer maybe not being as transparent as you would like them to be, ask those direct questions in the interviews, right? If it seems like it's too much, ask that question. How do you envision all of this being balanced in one, right? That is important, because you have to remember too, especially once you get to the interview stage, you're interviewing them as well, and you need to make sure it is the right job for you. Especially if you're not in a desperate situation to find a paying gig. But I do believe that all of us carry a responsibility to keep this profession ethical, and that we really ought to be centered on the worker. So I think if we have that opportunity to be more mindful of the job description as well as what we're applying for, I think that's what we can all do our part there. So I do urge you to do that. I think that's a really important part of the hiring process.
Great. I love your response. Very detailed. Great job, everybody. So we have a second guided question, and I just want to point out that technically we're going to 3:45 with the guided questions, but if anyone can stay on, we do have this time until 4:30. And so if there's someone's really itching to ask a open question, we'll have more time after 4 o'clock. Just want to keep everyone in line. So our next question excuse me, our next question is, what are some of the most frequent missed opportunities you see happen with applicants? So let's start with Katie this time.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So one of the things that we see time and time again is a missed opportunity with the questions you have prepared and the questions that you ask at the end of an interview. So I think candidates miss this time and time again, where I don't know, maybe they feel bad, or like they want to be respectful of the person's time, or maybe they're unprepared. But we've seen candidates, and even when I've interviewed people and I ask at the end of the interview, do you have any questions, and they're like, no, actually you've pretty much answered it. Me, as the person conducting the interview, sometimes I may take that as, oh my gosh, are they really not excited about this, or maybe they're not really interested. So always, always, always come prepared. Again, it goes back to preparing. 3 to 4 questions to ask the interviewer, and make sure that those are very detailed and thought out questions. We don't want a question of, well, what's your hybrid schedule, or what are the hours? Like, no, this is your time to really find out, more about the specifics of the role, the company, that person's management style. I mean, there's so much to go over during an interview. And sometimes when there's 30 minutes, it's impossible to do that. So take advantage of that. But, a couple examples of questions that you can ask are, of the people that you have managed who have been successful in this position, what made them stand out from the others? Or you can ask the manager, what are your expectations of somebody in this role in their first few months or even within the first year? Another question, what are the top 3 initiatives or goals of the department for 2026? Just to give you some insight and get the person talking a little bit more, and then maybe they may share something that piques your interest, and then that, continues the conversation. So don't ever make it, don't ever feel bad. And I was talking to my colleague and she said, oh gosh, when I first got out of college, me and my friends were scared to ask a question because we thought it made us seem like we didn't listen or we were uneducated. No, don't ever think that. Employers want to see curiosity. And actually, I think, Dana, you were the one that mentioned curiosity as well. That's really one of the number one things that we look for. It shows your interest level, your excitement. It shows that you've been engaged during the interview. And candidates that come with that curiosity, uh, I would say, 9 times out of 10 are the ones moving on to the next round or getting the offer for that role. So, and then another one I wanted to point out, and this kind of goes off of what Dana was just sharing about applying to positions. There are a lot of employers out there when they list the requirements of the job, it could be their wish list and not necessarily the absolute like 100% requirement to get the job. So if there's something that's listed on the requirement that you don't have, or maybe they want 5+ years of experience and you only have 2, I would encourage you to still apply as long as it's within reason, because you never know what they have some flexibility on. Still be targeted in what you're applying to, because I know it is time consuming. But if there's something that's just a little bit off that you're like, ooh, I don't have that one thing, still apply. So I talk to employers and they'll send me their job description, and I'm literally going through with them the requirements and where do you have flexibility and where do you not, in order to find them the right candidate. So if you're a little bit low on experience, still go for it. You may not, you won't know where the flexibility is, so you might as well, give it a shot.
I like that. Conflicting answers, but I like that.
Yeah, and so, but it's kind of more if there's one thing, or maybe you're a
Yeah,
little bit light on experience. But I do agree with Dana on the rest of the
yeah,
points, though.
right.
If it's so far off, move on.
Yeah,
There's going to be something else out there for you.
yeah. And you honestly like never know where an employer is coming from. Like you said, this may be a wish list. It may be based in reality. It's all about, you got to get in there and see what it's about.
And if you
Go ahead,
have
Dana.
the transferable skills and you can make the case, then that's
Yes.
worth something. It's
Mhm.
just, I see a lot of like newly graduated students applying for jobs that require 5 years of experience. Like that's a stretch. Save your application. There's a reason they want years of experience.
Mhm. So if you want to go ahead, Dana, you can answer next.
Sure. So again, I go back to the cover letter. I think a lot of applicants throw that cover letter away. And I mentioned, how it is the sort of embodiment of, one of the key skills we have. But I also, what I see happen a lot is um, applicants will use the cover letter to tell their story. And that, as someone reviewing many, many applications at once, that isn't really what I need at that moment, right? I often advise people to treat the cover letter as the thing to get you the interview, not the job, right? So your goal of the cover letter is to focus on the job description, what you've done that matches what they need and what that impact, what impact you've had. And then, you want to convince them that you can do the job and make their lives easier. For me, the cover letter is more about who you can be to the employer. And then it's that interview that you can tell your story and that um, you get that personalized moment with someone and can, share, that's again, like I say, like that when I look for like what their values may be. And some of that does come across in the cover letter, but I've read so many cover letters that are like, I loved going to museums as a child. And then and it's like, I need the info. We have to keep it moving, and it's not that I don't want to know that information, but I want to know, like, I want to get down to brass tacks. Are you qualified for this job? And then once you move to the next stage, then, I'd be happy to hear that full story. So I do think that's a something often missed. Thank you emails, especially if you're interested in the job, I really do recommend sending, just a reminder that you're still there, restate why you're interested and how you might be a good fit. I know it's tough to do if they're moving quickly. I've myself have been in that position where I'm like, oh, I haven't even sent a thank you note yet, and I'm, being asked for a second interview. So, maybe prepare something. Like if it's a job you think you really want, prepare something before you even have that first round interview to just thank them, or even that second round interview. Um, you don't have to be the first person to apply. If there is a deadline, honestly, the best applications come the day before the deadline or on the date of the deadline. It's usually those first couple days when people apply that are typically the weakest applications because it's clear they haven't spent time tailoring the resume and the cover letter. Um, so, I think taking in, it won't be, if it's late, that's not great. But if you get it in toward the end, closer to the deadline, I don't see a problem with that, especially if you've spent time with it. And then just a reminder, again, I think people forget that you also should be interviewing the employer. And to Katie's point, like you should have questions ready to go. You should be curious, be skeptical. If you hear something that sounds too good to be true, ask more questions, because I think that that's a signal that you might really be interested and could be a good addition, and thoughtful addition to the team.
Great. And Hillary, go ahead.
All right. So again, we're asking what are some of the most frequently missed opportunities that I see with applicants. There's two for me. It's first of all how they present their experience, and how they describe their thinking. And sometimes I'm amazed at the number of conversations I have where the things that I'm expecting to hear really don't come through. So on the experience side, I find often that candidates don't fully explain the why behind the projects that they've worked on. And I'm going back to things that, Dana and Katie have also talked about here. Um, but I'll oftentimes see descriptions of tasks, processing a collection, creating a finding aid, but without any context. And that context is really key. I want to hear your understanding of the purpose of a project. Who was it for? What impact did it have? Showing that you understand the importance of that context, that turns a list of responsibilities into a clear demonstration of professional work, and that's what I want to hear. Similarly, I often see a lack of specificity. It's hard to evaluate an experience without a sense of scale. So when candidates are talking about a collection, you should be sure to mention, how large was the collection? How, how many different formats were involved? What were those formats? What was the time frame? What was the level of complexity? Don't gloss over that too much. Like we want to know the details there. And those details do matter because, they really help me understand the scope of the work and your role within it. The other major missed opportunity is around, and I talked about this earlier, is demonstrating the thinking and the judgment. We know archival work is just filled with decision making, but I find the candidates don't always talk about it. I want to hear how you prioritize things, how you approach a new or disorganized collection, and how you're making your choices to that. And connected to that, I also think that candidates sometimes avoid talking about ambiguity or challenges, because they want their work to come across as polished and good and well done, and that's understandable. But in reality, I mean, we all know what working in archives is like. As I said before, they're rarely ideal environments. Collections are incomplete, they're messy. We're all constrained by time and resources. So acknowledging those challenges and explaining how you handled them is actually a strength, not a weakness. Um, it shows your judgment, adaptability, and really a realistic understanding of work. Um, I think we want to work in realism when we're talking about positions, talking about the work to be done. Everybody is better off if we're talking about the reality of the situation. Um, so overall, I think the biggest mixed opportunities are again not fully showing the context of your work, and not fully showing how you think, and those are the things that for me really help a candidate stand out.
Great, great. So that was perfect. So we've reached the end of our guided Q&A with our pre-set up questions. So I think would now be a good time to stop the recording, Gretchen.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop now.
All right. Bye, recording. Okay.